Okay, welcome to the UCLA Anderson Forecast's February 2025 episode of its Forecast Direct podcast. My name is Clement Bohr, and for this episode, we have the privilege of talking with Joseph Stiglitz about some of his most recent work. So, Joe is someone who needs no introduction, but just to highlight some of his achievements, he has made fundamental contributions to the field of information economics, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. He has served in public policy positions as the chief economist of the World Bank and as the chair of Council of Economic Advisors under President Bill Clinton. And Joe is also the author of numerous influential books, including Globalization and Its Discontents, The Price of Inequality, and now his newest book, The Road to Freedom. So, Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here.
So I want to begin the conversation with asking you about a couple of the central points in your most recent book, The Road to Freedom. And an important part of the book is that it reflects much of the work you've done throughout your career as well, and that is your critique of neoliberal capitalism. But this is a fairly abstract concept and perhaps, not very well known to many people. So would you mind briefly and just first explaining what it is that you mean by neoliberalism, or what is meant by neoliberalism?
Well, neoliberalism was a set of ideas, doctrines that became fashionable in the middle of the last century. The term neo means new, liberalism, free. It was paying homage to the liberalism of the 19th century, but it says it was reinvented. It was new, but it wasn't much reinvented. It was basically the old liberalism. And it was the idea that if you had laissez-faire, free markets, unfettered markets, let the market rip, you would not only get efficiency, everybody would be better off. That somehow the pie would be bigger, and trickle-down economics would ensure that everybody would benefit. As one of our presidents put it, a rising tide lifts all boats. And they sort of believed that mystically that would happen.
Right.
There was neither theory nor evidence for most of the parts of this doctrine. And we've now had 45 years, 50 years of this, you might call it, grand experiment. And things haven't worked out very well. Growth was slower since 1980 than it was in the decades before. And almost all the growth has gone to those at the top, so that those in the middle have seen their income stagnate, and those at the bottom are even worse off. So in terms of the prediction of the theory, if you call it that, they haven't been borne out.
Right.
Meanwhile, economic theory itself advanced a lot. Even before the ideas of neoliberalism became widely adopted in, say, 1980 under Reagan and Thatcher, the question, fundamental economics have been questioned. Some people trace the idea of these unfettered markets back to Adam Smith, who talked about the pursuit of self-interest leagues as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. But if you read Adam Smith, he didn't believe it. He talked about the importance of labor regulation, the dangers of monopoly. He was much more concerned, supportive of a well-regulated economy, not laissez-faire.
So if I may stop you there, because that gets, actually to the title of your book, which is called The Road to Freedom, which is a play on Friedrich Hayek's book's title, The Road to Serfdom. And, relative to Adam Smith, Friedrich Hayek was actually one of the more, not current, but one of the main thinkers behind neoliberalism and one of the main proponents of it. And like you mentioned, one of the core ideas that he advocated for is really to let markets rip, and that they will be efficient when left to themselves, where competition is going to play this crucial role of eliminating any of the rent-seeking behavior of firms and lead to the survival of the fittest and most productive firms, right? So he had this sort of evolutionary take on economics. And in your book, and what you just mentioned a bit about, is that, in fact, sometimes the opposite actually seems to hold true, that unregulated markets lead to more monopolization rather than more competition. So can you explain perhaps what is, missing from the standard framework in economic thought? Specifically, why would it be the case that the competitive forces wouldn't dominate, say, the monopolistic forces in all cases?
It's actually fairly complex, and there are a lot of assumptions that go into the invisible hand theorem, into Milton Friedman's articulation of this, and Friedrich Hayek. Let me first say that the economic theory is very clear now that under very plausible assumptions, the invisible hand doesn't work, and that competitive markets are not efficient, let alone fair. I think the easiest way to understand where they went wrong is in terms of what it takes to make profits. The idea of Adam Smith was that the pursuit of self-interest meant maximizing profits. And he had in mind the idea that you maximize profits by producing goods that people wanted at lower cost. That's one way you make profits. But there are a couple of other ways you make profits. Another way you make profits is by creating barriers to competition, becoming a monopolist. Adam Smith worried about that. And by exploiting other people, exploiting their vulnerabilities. Still another way of making profits after taxes is to figure out how to avoid paying your fair share of taxes. Many companies do an excellent job, including our tech giants, who, while they make products that people like, are also even better at tax avoidance. So these are a couple of the other ways that are not socially productive. Let me give you a third way that is a kind of example of exploitation, and is very related to the theme of my book. If you're a mining company, you can make profits by polluting. That imposes costs on others, very high costs. Cost on our planet, putting us at risk. So, and then you can use your money that you make to lobby Congress not to regulate you. So you win twice. You pollute, you use the profit from the pollution to make sure that you have the right to pollute. And that is not a way to enhance the well-being of our society. So there are many examples along these lines that I could cite, but that gives you sort of an intuition about why it is that laissez-faire, unfettered markets often don't lead to the well-being of our society.
Right. Like, as you say, there's many ways firms can maximize profits. It's not as simple as what the theory purports. But let's get into the theory that you mentioned a little bit, that there is some complexity to it, improving the efficiency of markets, this was something you talked about early on in the book, and at least was enlightening to me, is how you were essentially talking about the fundamental theorems of welfare economics. And you were really pointing out that neoliberalism had in some ways misinterpreted them, or using them in a way that wasn't really what they were actually saying. To me, the welfare theorems of economics are, and the misunderstood version of Adam Smith's hand is one of the sort of beautiful parts of economics as a capitalistic system. And this system is actually able to create an outcome where everyone mutually thrives, even though people only need to worry about doing what is right for them, near them, which is a very doable way to do things. So I'd love to hear two things. First, I'd love to hear your description of the welfare theorems of economics and the specific assumptions that they rely upon that makes the outcome efficient. And then second, if you could describe how these theorems have been, in a sense, misused by neoliberalism as an argument for it being optimal to leave markets untouched and unregulated, when it is in fact actually a leap of faith to make such a conclusion.
So what's called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics is just the formalization of Adam Smith's invisible hand. And it says that under a certain set of conditions, if you have a competitive economy with individuals maximizing their utility and firms maximizing their profits or the value, their market value, then the outcome is efficient in a particular sense called Pareto efficient, which means that no one could be made better off without making someone worse off. And as you say, it's every student of economics just it marvels at this idea. It took the economics profession a long time to find the conditions under which it was true. It wasn't, Adam Smith wrote in 1776, it wasn't until Gerard Debreu and Ken Arrow in the late 1950s, 175 years later, actually proved the conditions under which it was true. And what they showed is that those conditions were pretty restrictive, that there couldn't be externalities, as we call them, things like pollution that we were talking about before, that there can't be market power. And when they meant not market power, they meant every firm was really small, that it faced an absolutely horizontal demand curve, can sell as much as it wanted at the going market price. Then my own work began with Arrow and Debreu. They had provided a set of conditions under which markets were efficient. We would say they're sufficient conditions, so they weren't necessary. And I asked, well, was the theorem more generally true? And were there some more qualifications that they hadn't fully taken into account? And the result for the advocates of market fundamentalism for laissez-faire economics were very disappointing. It turned out that essentially the only conditions under which markets were efficient were those that Arrow and Debreu had defined, that the restrictive conditions were even more restrictive. There had to be a full set of insurance markets for every risk that was conceivable, that there couldn't be any imperfection of information. Information couldn't be endogenous, couldn't change with economic behavior. That technology had to be fixed. And one of the big reasons we like market economies is that they're supposed to be incentivizing innovation. But the theory was that soon as you allowed innovation, markets were no longer efficient. So what was an attempt to prove that markets were efficient, actually, when you dug underneath the surface, was a proof that markets were almost never efficient. and that there were an enormous scope for government intervention to make things better. In fact, the way I've sometimes put it, so much scope for government intervention. When asked the question, where does one begin first? And obviously, one begins where there are the strongest market failures, the most grievous problems like climate change, like in the areas of innovation, basic research, um, and health insurance. So over the succeeding 60 years, the economics profession has progressed by delineating areas where constructive intervention through government or other forms of collective action can actually make significant improvements in economic outcomes.
Right. This take on capitalism sort of reminds me of Churchill's famous quote about democracy, and that democracy is the worst form of governance except for all the other types of governance. Capitalism is amazing in a sense that it can perhaps get us, 70 or 80% of the way towards this sort of optimal outcome, but doesn't get us all the way there. And we're there because of all these messy details. And that's where, a government come in to right those wrongs, or to get us closer to an optimal outcome.
Actually, I'm a little bit less confident that markets will actually even get us that far. Okay. The fact is that without government basic research, we might not be having this conversation, because we wouldn't have the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. So, when you start thinking through all the important roles that government plays, they're actually essential. Now, markets are also essential. So I don't know. I don't like to parse it out. I just say we have to have both of them.
So, as you mentioned a little, towards the beginning of the interview, neoliberalism really swept the globe and became a dominant economic and political orthodoxy around 1980, which was marked both Reagan's presidency and Margaret Thatcher's premiership. And as we discussed, the core idea in that is that this deregulation of the economy and minimizing the role of the government will let markets become more efficient, leading to higher levels of growth and prosperity. But, and you also mentioned this briefly, is that if you actually look at what's happened since 1980, is that everything seems to be going the opposite direction than what they promised would happen, which is that the U.S. economy has grown substantially slower since what it did before 1980. There's been this rise in inequality, where most of the income gains have gone to those at the top of the income distribution. And then we also had the Great Recession, which, was the greatest recession we've had since the Great Depression. And it was part result of this excessive risk-taking and poorly regulated financial markets. So, just from this, it really does sound like neoliberalism has been a failure in some regards. But what is is there any better causal evidence that it is, in fact, the neoliberalist policies that led to this degradation in economic performance?
Well, I think the way one should think about these failures is to think about what causes economic growth, economic success, economic inequality, and how the neoliberal agenda affected what we are seeing. So one of the things that the neoliberal agenda did was denigrate the role of government. It talked about low taxes, low regulation. Think about the existential crisis we're in today, climate change. That's a major externality. They said externalities weren't that important. They obviously are. But there are other kinds of externalities that we come to learn about. If banks are connected with each other and connected to the rest of the economy, and they undertake excessive risk-taking, then we can have a financial crisis.
Yeah.
We learned that before the Great Depression. We had 50 years in which there was almost no banking crises. We learned the wrong lesson. People say, oh, we know banking crises are a thing of the past, so let's deregulate. Well, the reason they were a thing of the past is because we have regulation. As soon as we deregulated, guess what? Banking crises came back, and the world's been afflicted by banking crisis after banking crisis, financial crisis after financial crisis in one country or another. So that's another example where you can clearly understand that as a failure of the neoliberal agenda. It was interesting. I was in the Clinton administration, in the first Clinton administration, and we had a lot of debates about financial deregulation, and I took the stance that theory was pretty clear about what happens if you deregulate, and practice was pretty clear about what happens. But U.S. Treasury and Wall Street pushed ahead on financial deregulation, and unfortunately, we bore the fruits. We suffered the consequences in the financial crisis of 2008-9. We can go through each of the aspects of what makes for a good economy. You need to have a competitive economy to get the fruits that we describe. But I mentioned before, firms are very good in creating monopolies. A lot more fun being a monopolist than being a competitor. As I tell my students in business school, when you're a competitor, profits get driven down to zero. You can't go around in your luxury cars. But if you can create a monopoly, things are actually quite nice. So there's a strong proclivity to create market power,
right,
unless you have regulatory agencies that try to curb the creation of market power. So these are just a few of the examples of the causal link between neoliberalism and the travails that we are in today.
So is it fair to summarize that you believe that neoliberalism has, as a country, made us both poorer in terms of the total whole economy pie has grown by less than it otherwise would have? And on top of that, it's also made us more unequal with a larger share of the relatively smaller pie going to the richest?
Very much so.
Yeah. But that begs the question then, what do we do about it? And so in your book, you call for what you call progressive capitalism, which is similar to what was promoted by Teddy Roosevelt back in the beginning of the 20th century. So could you explain, more specifically what you mean by progressive capitalism? What are the key pillars of it, and how would they mitigate our problems of low economic growth and inequality?
Well, there are several key pillars. One of them is that we need a rich array of institutional arrangements. So I've already talked about the importance of government. You need public investment. You need in education, infrastructure, technology, basic R&D. That's one. You need other forms of collective action. We have a complex society, and the poor can't speak out individually, but for themselves. But unions can represent them if they are well-regulated unions. In many societies, even in America, cooperatives play an important role. The one part of our financial system that didn't undertake the excesses of risk-taking and that performed after the 2008 crisis better in terms of continuing to lend to small businesses was our co-ops, which we call credit unions. And there are many other parts of our economy where cooperatives are important. Finally, I should mention a very important part of our institutional structure are NGOs, civil society. One of the most influential parts of our economy are our universities. And it's the root of our success, I think. It's where research goes on. It's given us the technological lead over other countries. And almost all of our leading, or at least many of our leading institutions are NGOs and not-for-profits like Columbia, Princeton, and the others are state universities like UCLA. So none of them are for-profit institutions. So this just illustrates the fact that in our modern complex society, we need a rich array of institutions. We also need regulation, environment, competition, preventing exploitation of a whole variety of kinds, safety.
Right. So with that, Teddy Roosevelt was famously known as the trust buster. So one thing you haven't mentioned is antitrust policy. So how big a role does that fit in, or how does that fit into this discussion?
Well, I have mentioned it a couple of times because I said what makes a competitive economy work is competition. Yeah. And as Adam Smith pointed out, firms don't like competition, and they get together to try to, in one way or another, reduce competition. And that's why competition authorities are really, really important. The work of competition authorities today is more complex than it was in Teddy Roosevelt's era. Then you have Standard Oil, you break it up. It was seemingly relatively easy. There's been a lot of innovation in our economy, including in innovation in how to be anti-competitive. Anti-competitive contracts, a whole series of anti-competitive practices, and firms are very successful in creating moats that protect them from competition. One example is that firms buy other firms that are potential competitors when they're just nascent. And so some of our dynamic firms, seemingly dynamic, one of the ways they maintain their market dominance is by buying up potential competitors.
Right. So one very famous example of that is how Facebook, now known as Meta, bought up both Instagram and WhatsApp when they were very small companies, and now have become, if they had grown on their own, they would be, probably even dominate what Facebook is now.
Yeah, and my own view is they should be forced to divest. But the standard doctrine, which looks at their current position and says, is it undermining current market, increasing current market concentration, is clearly not the right criteria for evaluating whether a merger is anti-competitive. And the merger guidelines that were enunciated a little over a year ago make that very clear. And I hope under the new administration, those merger guidelines will stay in force.
Right. So I have to ask, as a citizen of a Nordic country, your progressive capitalism sounds very similar to the type of governance we have there and market structure. So, beyond details, is there any large difference in what you're promoting than what is already implemented in countries such as Denmark and Sweden?
It's very similar, as you say, and I talk about that in my book. I use the word rejuvenated social democracy. Countries in Europe call themselves social democracies. And the reason why I say rejuvenated is because several of the Scandinavian countries have come under undue influence of neoliberalism. And so they move more towards from their roots as social democracies into something, a more progressive version of neoliberalism than you saw in the United States, but still neoliberalism. But when you mention the Scandinavian social democracy, I want to highlight one thing about the name social democracy, and that is the word democracy. Democracy, in my mind, is very important because you need to tame power, and it's through democratic processes that you tame it. And part of then of what I talk about in my progressive capitalism or rejuvenated social democracy is that you cannot allow the agglomeration of excessive economic power, because excessive agglomeration of economic power will almost inevitably translate into excesses of political power. And another aspect of that is one can't allow excessive influence of money in politics. And America has failed in both respects, enormous economic inequality and enormous influence of money in politics. And now everybody in the United States is talking about the American oligarchs.
Right. Okay. So one of the specific policy levers that governments have is the use of taxes in many ways, but specifically what I want to talk about next is on corporate profits. And this is particularly pertinent right now because Republicans, as you know, in Congress are trying to write a new tax bill to keep corporate taxes low or even reduce them further. And you have a new academic paper out called Equity Prices, Market Power, and Optimal Corporate Tax Policy, and that it's written with your co-authors at American University, Ignacio Gonzalez and Juan Montecino. And so in this paper, you turn one of the classic economic results on its head and argue that, in fact, high corporate tax rates may actually induce higher levels of investment and a more efficient allocation of capital, which is a pretty stark result. But before we even get there, can you, just to set the benchmark, can you explain what the standard economic conventional wisdom on the topic of corporate taxation of profits is?
Yeah. So the conventional models treated the corporate profits tax as if it were a tax on capital in the corporate sector. And so it suggested that it discouraged investment, it discouraged economic activity in the corporate sector, and so it was discouraging one of the most important parts of the economy. And where I turned that on its head was in two ways. First, goes back to a paper I wrote in 1973, where I pointed out that the corporate profits tax is a tax on corporate profits. You might say that's not a great insight, but the point is, corporate profits, you are allowed to deduct what you spend on labor, but you're also allowed to deduct what you spend on capital. At the time, the way you deducted what you spent on capital was through depreciation allowances, which you took the value of the machines that you bought and you spread it over a number of years, but it added up essentially to the cost of the machine itself. And your profits were earned over a number of years, and there was a slight discrepancy, but actually it turned out in most cases, capital was being subsidized, not taxed. But when we had the 2017 tax law, you were allowed to deduct the actual cost of the machine.
Right, direct expensing. Yeah.
You expense the machine. And that meant it was perfectly clear it was not a tax on capital because you could deduct what you spent on capital. So the first idea was get rid of the idea that the corporate profits tax is a tax on capital. It's not. It's a tax on pure profits. And what does that mean? It's a tax on what you earn in excess of what your inputs. It's basically a return, a tax on the return on monopoly.
Right. So what the new term you introduce in this paper is what you call market power wealth.
That's
So
right.
can you explain it? So this is, I guess, what you were alluding to, what the second term comes in. So can you explain why that is so important for the discussion on the optimal rate of corporate profit taxes?
Well, you ask, what is really the value of the firm? The value of the firm is the value of its physical capital plus the value of its future pure profits. That is to say, the present discounted value of its rents, its monopoly profits. And this is where the effect of taxation goes just the opposite of the traditional analysis. Individuals take their earnings, wage earnings, or maybe capital earnings, and have to decide what to do with them. They can take that and invest it in a fiscal machine, in a plant, productive capital. They can invest it in R&D, again, kind of productive capital, or they can invest it in this market wealth capital. And the greater the market wealth capital, the less money that's left over to invest in real capital, productive capital. So if you increase the tax on corporate profits, the present discounted value of this market wealth capital goes down. And that means, given people savings, more of that savings will go into productive capital.
Right.
And that enhances the productivity of the economy.
It,
So taxing corporate profits actually enhances productivity.
right. And you find, rather strikingly in the paper that if firms are able to expense their capital investments, then the optimal corporate profit tax rate is 100%, which seems rather stark, but, relative to the argument you just made, anything lower than 100% would actually seem a bit odd. Why wouldn't you want to reduce the the non-productive investment completely?
That's right. Shrinking the non-productive capital expands the productive capital. It's that simple. Now,
Yeah.
the world is more complex, and so in practice, no one would ever go that far. But analytically, the result is very clear. You want to have the non-productive capital as small as possible, so you can have the productive capital as large as possible.
You're right. Okay. So lastly, I want to read a small excerpt from the final paragraph of the conclusion in your paper, where you write that an important limitation of our analysis is that we have omitted other empirically relevant sources of corporate profits, such as risk and quasi-rents from innovations. Indeed, if corporate profits partially reflect the return on risk-taking and loss offsetting provisions in the tax code are imperfect, a higher corporate tax rate would tend to discourage investment. Similarly, if innovation activity is driven by quasi-rents, then raising the corporate tax rate would be expected to decrease economic growth. So if combined with our market power wealth mechanism, both of these channels would likely push the optimal corporate tax rate downward. Right. So the absence of these two forces, which is one is risk and the other one is profits as a motive for or an incentive for innovation, they both seem to be, very central and critical parts of this analysis that you mentioned here that you omitted. And especially to me, the innovation incentive or profit seems to be central to the whole, capitalistic mechanism of growth. So can you explain why you left them out of your analysis or how we should understand your paper in light of them?
Yeah. I was trying to make sure I wasn't claiming too much, and introducing them into the analysis would have made the analysis much more complicated. But let me go through both of them and try to explain why things are actually more ambiguous than that paragraph would seem to suggest.
Okay.
So first, with respect to risk-taking, there is a very well-known result that says that the corporate profits tax with perfect loss offsets actually encourages investment. And the reason for it can be put intuitively is the government is acting as a silent partner, taking 50% of the gains, bearing 50% of the losses. You're bearing, therefore, it's less risky. It's sharing the risk. It's a silent partner. And when you have a silent partner, you're willing to take more risk because they're absorbing half the risk. You're willing to take on more risk. So in the presence of perfect risk loss offset, then actually a corporate profits tax encourages investment of all kinds. Now, that one has to accompany that by the caveat that we don't have perfect loss offsets. There's a debate about how poor, just how imperfect they are. Some of the complexity is that a firm with a lot of losses can be bought by another firm, and that other firm can realize those losses. And so, in fact, our system actually has pretty good loss offset provisions. So given that, I'm a little bit, I think I probably underestimated. I think actually taking into account risk would make my case even stronger for a high tax rate.
All right, Joe. Well, thank you so much for coming on the UCLA Anderson Forecast podcast, Forecast Direct. It was a pleasure talking to you and hearing about your recent book and recent research. All right. Thank you.
All right.